Hi everyone, welcome to our Masterclass for February 2018. Thanks so much for joining me for our monthly session where you get an opportunity to learn a little bit about or a little bit more about some of our topics that we're covering inside the community and in our monthly growing guides. Now, thanks to everyone who voted. Let's go to the next slide. And the topic of choice for February is maintaining your tools and equipment. This is a really great topic. I do get asked a lot about what tools to use for different gardening jobs and how to look after them and which ones to buy. So in this masterclass, I'm going to go through just some extra little ideas, probably mostly from my experiences using gardening tools over many, many years. And hopefully you'll be able to now go and choose the tools and equipment to suit the jobs that you're going to want to be doing in your garden. Okay, in this masterclass, we'll cover choosing tools for the job, keeping them sharp, which is really important, caring for your quality tools, which is also very important to make sure that you're using very good quality tools, and some other regularly used equipment that you're going to need for all your fun gardening activities. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is really look at choosing the right tools for the jobs that you want to do. So when you're looking at tools you need to buy, or maybe the job that you're doing and deciding which tools you need, you firstly need to look at what jobs you need doing. Do you need to do some pruning? Then you would obviously need cutting tools. Do you really need to trim some branches of some trees? So then maybe you'll need a handsaw. Do you need to do some digging around or plant trees? It does really depend on the job you're doing to choosing the right tool. So we are going to look at a few different tools and jobs in a moment. Also have a look at what is your budget. So obviously you want to try and save some money, but when you're buying really high quality tools, they can last you for a very long time if you look after them. So sometimes in the beginning it's worth spending a bit of extra money, but knowing that you'll have your tools for a very long time. And I'm quickly just going to go back a slide and show you a picture of, yes, that's my dirty pocket where I keep my Felco secateurs. Now, I've had those same pair of Felcos for maybe 17 years now. They regularly get sharpened. They do get a little bit of an oil. I like to use a drop of olive oil on them or another vegetable oil on my tools. But those I keep in my pocket when I'm out in the garden and working. So they cost me around 100 Australian dollars. I think they're around that price, maybe a little bit less, maybe around the $80 mark, but it's worth spending that money knowing that you will have those tools for a very long time. And they work really well once I keep them sharp and also oiled. They're working for me for any pruning and cutting job around the garden. I still use them most days now. Okay, so thinking about the jobs you need, and then you would choose appropriate tools, looking at your budget. What materials do you prefer? So this comes down to really the materials that the tools are made of. Some people, like I do, I prefer steel tools because they are tougher and they're stronger and they last a lot longer. You'll see that garden fork on the right. I like to use steel or metal tools with timber handles, but you can also get plastic handles which are a little bit lighter. So get a feel for the different materials that the tools are made of and see which suits you. So you might like to choose plastic tools because they are lighter to hold and lift and use out in the garden. Or if you don't mind the steel tools, which do last a long time provided they don't rust, they are a little bit heavier as you're using them. So when you're going to buy your tools, hold and lift and sort of move around with the different tools you're looking at to find which ones are comfortable. That's another really good thing when you're choosing your secateurs. Make sure they fit comfortably in your hand and they feel nice as you open and close them. I know with the Felco, they have many different sizes and sort of shapes, so it took me a little while to work out which ones felt comfortable. and now mine, which I think are number 2, but I better check on the size. It could be a 9. I'll have to go and have a look. They I feel really comfortable in my hand. It's like putting on an old pair of shoes or slippers. You know, they just feel so good when I hold them, and they're very comfortable for me to use. Some people don't like the feel of them and prefer different size tools. So yeah, hold them in your hand, have a little feel of them as you're purchasing them, because some will feel different to others based on the materials they're made of, and you'll find something comfortable to suit you. Also consider how often they're going to be used. So for me, I do a lot of pruning. When I go to see clients, if I'm helping them with pruning, or my workshops, I'm constantly using my secateurs most days out in my own garden as well. So I want to spend a little bit more money and have a better quality tool, knowing how much I'm going to use them. If it's something you might just use every now and again, like for me, it's just a plastic rake. I don't use a rake that often. I occasionally use it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of money on a rake. I just want a nice plastic one here when I do need to rake some leaves or over some mulch. But I don't use it very often, so I'm not going to spend so much money or get such a good quality rake, knowing I don't need it that often. I would rather spend the money on something that I'm going to be using all the time. Okay, so when we look at the different jobs that we're going to do in our garden, they do take a different tool to do it. So I'll just go through these. These are probably the tools that you would use the most for digging. So the top right image is just a little steel hand trowel with a wooden handle. So that's going to be for digging small holes, maybe for seedlings or small little potted herbs. You would use those. These hand trowels also work really well as scoops when you're filling up pots or mixing ingredients. You might mix some compost and manure or something together. Hand trowels like that are quite good to use. So again, when you're choosing these ones, hold them in your hand and make sure they feel comfortable. If you don't want something that's so heavy, maybe choose a plastic one. It's not going to last as well when you're digging in the ground, but you will find it lighter to use and hold, or you might even find some of the children's hand tools are much easier to use than some of the heavier steel ones. So have a feel of those as you're choosing them to use in the garden, but there's all different handles on them. You might choose plastic or wood, and it's just very personal preference. Okay, the shovel underneath that on the left at the bottom is a long-handled shovel. Now, these are used for digging holes in the garden, especially if you're planting trees and shrubs. So when you're digging a good-sized hole in the ground, you need a long handle to push hard into the ground, and also then use your foot maybe to leverage it a little bit and dig your hole. It's much easier to dig a hole with a long-handled shovel than a shorter spade shovel, which is in the picture on the right. Much, much easier to dig holes. You can also mix up your compost or shovel some manure around your garden using a long-handled shovel as well. But long-handled shovels, it's a nice square edge on that one, and it has the little tip, little edge at the top for you to put your foot on and leverage that to dig a hole. So that's a digging shovel, that one. Now the bottom right, the green one with the handle, is more of a spade. So that would be really good if you're turning over your soil or blending things together, or if you've got quite a sandy soil and it's easy to sort of dig, you don't need to use much force to dig a hole, a spade is going to be okay. Or if you would rather use it and be able to hold on to that handle while you're digging holes, that's suitable as well. But if you're breaking up heavy soil and you really need to use the force of your arms and your shoulders to dig that hard ground and dig a hole, you're not going to be able to do that with a spade, because the handle is shorter and you can't sort of get a good grip on it and dig in the ground. So the spade is very different than the shovel, but both are used for digging in the earth. they're just depending on the soil you have and what it is that you're going to be digging. I find the spade I use in the garden, say if I get a load of mushroom compost or I'm composting and I just want to mix things over and gently dig the top layer of soil, I use a short-handled spade and also a short-handled fork as well. And I do like the handles on the end of those. They make sort of leveraging the tool around a little bit easier, whereas the long-handled shovel doesn't actually have a handle on the end. It's just usually a wooden or a plastic, very long handle on that. Now the top right is a metal mattock. Usually with your mattock, they have two different ends on them. You'll see the spike at the top is really good for breaking up very heavy or rocky soils and hard ground. The other end, which, sorry, it's hard to see, there's a bit of a blade on the end of that. That's really good if you want to, say, remove a tree or a shrub and you need to dig out the roots or dig a hole into a heavy soil. That's got a short handle on it, and it's the type of tool that you sort of swing up a little bit high, nothing higher than shoulder height, but you sort of lift it up to, say, chest height, and then heavily force it into the ground, let's say, to dig that hole or remove that tree root or the stump or something like that. So a mattock is really, again, a stronger tool for a harder, tougher gardening or digging job. So if you do have a bit of space outside and you're going to be digging different holes, and you may like to or consider removing some shrubs or digging trenches and things, you'll need a mattock, and you'll probably need a long-handled shovel as well. And a spade is very handy for lighter loosening up of soil. And then you obviously have your little hand trowel for digging smaller holes, maybe in the veggie bed or some flowers in the flower garden, but smaller digging there. So there's 4 good tools I would suggest having in your equipment to use for different digging jobs. Okay, the next one, pruning, and I apologise, I realised these images are quite fuzzy, so I'm sorry for that. I'll find some clear ones and put them in our Facebook group for you. Now, another job as a gardener you'll be doing a lot of is pruning. So the top left, the top left is an image of the secateurs. So you're going to be pruning smaller size stems. I would say those hand secateurs would probably go up to a diameter of about 10 centimetres of a stem. Anything over that, you'll need some loppers, which are on the right hand side. Now, I'm sorry you can't see that blade, but they do have a bigger, thicker blade. It's quite sharp, but having those long handles on them gives you better leverage to cut through, say, a diameter up to 20 or 25 centimetres. So you can get different loppers for different thicknesses of stems. So if you have some tree branches to cut or larger shrubs that have thicker stems, a thicker diameter stems, then use the long-handled loppers. It makes cutting jobs much, much easier. On the bottom left, the lady is using some hedging shears. Now, again, they have a long handle, which means it's easier to control those and use them rather than a short handle, but they have a longer blade, so they're used for hedging shrubs and cutting smaller diameter of the stems and mainly leaves. So the hedging shears are used for softer foliage, more to shape hedges and topiaries. You can take the top off some herbs, like I use my hedging shears just to trim the top off my rosemary, just to keep those down a bit in size. And semi-hedged, I don't cut them to a formal hedge. I'd probably say they're more of a semi-formal hedge, but they're just really handy to trim off the tops of the foliage. Now, the bottom right is a hand saw. That blade is metal. It's got a lot of serrated teeth, and it has a short wooden handle. Now, a hand saw is used probably over about 30 centimetres in diameter. So it would be for thicker stems and branches or trunks of trees that you need to cut where your loppers which is picture above, aren't enough. So for your pruning, you would start with your secateurs for the smaller stems. If they're anything over about 10 centimetres, maybe 15 centimetres maximum in diameter, go to your loppers. But then if you find you can't cut the thicker stems or the branches with those loppers, then go to a hand saw, and it will cut through anything up to even maybe 30, 40 centimetres or thicker in diameter. So I find the hand saw really useful for bigger shrubs that I'm cutting off branches or giving them a really good cut back. The hand saw works really well. So they're your main pruning tools. Make sure you keep them nice and sharp because it makes the job so much easier. And a few other things, and a couple more fuzzy photos, I'm sorry about that. A few other things that you would probably want to just make sure that you've got in your tool shed. So I mentioned before the hand trowel. There's just a few different ones that you can get. A hand fork is really good just for loosening up the soil. I find my hand fork really useful when I've emptied my compost bin and I just want to turn over like that top 5 centimetres of soil and blend the compost through and, you know, put in a little bit of blood and bone and just gently turn it over before planting. I find the hand fork works really, really well for that job. The little tool underneath it with like a 2-pronged is great for weeding. So if you've got weeds that you're trying to remove, the stem of the weed goes in the center of that fork looking tool, and you just leverage it out, pulls out weeds. It's great if you're pulling out really thick flat weeds in your grass. It's a really good tool for that. And the hand trowel underneath, actually, it's hard to see, but those little lines on there are actually measuring. So that tool is really good if you're digging holes to plant your seedlings or potted herbs or, you know, those small little pots, and also to dig holes to put bulbs in because you can measure the depth of the soil or the hole that you're digging. So that's a really good little tool to have. Now, obviously, the top, there's some gloves. It's always great to have gloves, especially to keep your hands protected if you're doing any pruning or have any spiky plants, or if you're using any fertilizers, because you definitely don't want to get any fertilizers or other products into any cuts or around your skin. They can irritate it and cause infections. Now, the bottom image is a garden fork. So they come with a long handle or a short handle. I like garden forks with a short handle, and they're really good, as you can see in this image, they're aerating the lawn. So you just push the prongs in, give them a little wiggle with your foot and your hands on the handle, lift it out, and then give your lawn a good soak. I also do this in my garden beds before adding soil for the growing season. So a garden fork, a 4-pronged metal garden fork, is very handy around the garden. It's also really good to loosen up the compost ingredients in your compost bin without having to turn it all. You just push the fork into the compost bin, wiggle it backwards and forwards, and that just helps to add a little bit of extra air as well. And on the right at the bottom is the plastic garden rake. I don't mind plastic rakes because I don't do a lot of raking, so I just tend to buy a cheap one at the store, but they are handy to have. Probably if you live in an area with a lot of deciduous trees, you're going to do a lot more raking than I do in my garden. So it's good to have a rake in the tool shed as well. Okay, once you've purchased and you've got your really good range of quality tools, it's really important to keep them clean, sharp, and rust-free to make sure that they last for years for you. Now, I found a photo of a man with a grinder sharpening a knife, but you can also use a grinder to sharpen all your metal tools, and even your shovels and your mattock can be sharpened, which makes it easier to dig holes in the ground. There is nothing worse than trying to dig a hole with a blunt shovel. It takes forever to dig that hole. So make sure that you keep your tools nice and sharp, especially all your cutting and pruning tools, because when they're sharp, they do lovely clean cuts on the plants and they don't actually damage or chew your plants, which can then cause diseases. So to look after your tools, make sure that you clean all your tools and equipment after use. This is really important if you're doing any pruning on plants that have diseases or pest problems, because you don't want to then transfer those problems to another plant through using your pruning tools or any of your cutting tools. So you want to make sure if you are pruning or cutting back any plants that have pests or disease damage, give them a wipe with some antibacterial cleaner or an oil after use, or after cutting those particular plants before you go on to the next ones, to make sure that you don't transfer any pests or disease pathogens onto the next plant. So make sure you keep everything clean after use or before you're going to use it. Hygiene is a very important part of gardening, to make sure that you have a especially disease-free but also pest-free garden. With all your metal tools and also your plastic ones, but mainly all the steel tools, dry them after use to prevent rusting. So if you find you need to give them a wash or a rinse after you've used them, maybe you've got some soil on your tools, or you've got lots of juice or foliage attached to the blades because you've done a lot of pruning and you feel like you need to give them a little wash, that's okay. Just get an old cloth, maybe with a little bit of oil on the cloth, and wipe over your tools. Make them dry, maybe dry them first and then wipe them over with an oily cloth. Now the oil will help to prevent any rusting on them. So especially if you've washed them and dried them, then get an old cloth and maybe use something like a linseed oil. Linseed oil is very good for garden tools. Just wipe the metal parts over and then store them in a nice dry location. And as I said, sharpen your tools regularly for really nice clean cuts. It also helps when the plant grows. It sort of needs to heal after being cut. The plants will scab over. So once they've got a nice clean cut, they will scab over better, which means they're less likely to, say, have any moisture get in and any diseases get in from that cut. So nice, sharp, clean tools are really good for pruning and digging and other jobs in the garden. Okay, a little tip, and I think this is a great one. It's a very an old way of looking after metal tools, is if you get a bucket of sand, and make sure it's coarse sand or river sand. Don't use beach sand. Because that will add to the rusting of your tools. A nice washed river sand is very good. Blend in some just get a cheap vegetable oil or linseed oil and just blend that through the sand. Don't make it too sort of sloppy and soggy. And then just dip your shovels and other bigger metal tools. Maybe you've got an axe or a mattock, or maybe you might have a metal rake. But any of them, just sort of plunge your tools and dip them in and out of the sandy, oily mix a few times, and then just give them a wipe off with an old cloth. And that means the coarse sand is actually going to help rub off the start of any rust, or take off a little bit of the rust that's on there. You could even rub the rust off with your fingers with a bit of that sand and make it like a bit of a paste. And then after you've had the sand either in the bucket or just rubbing it on, just give it a wipe off with a dry cloth. The oil will stay on there, and then you can store them in your shed, and that prevents any more rust forming on those little places where you may have removed some rust. That's a really good way of keeping those bigger tools, your bigger metal tools, rust-free in between being used. And also to keep the wooden handles, to prevent those from drying out and cracking, which then create splinters, which can get into your hands from that split and cracked wood, just get an old cloth and again use your linseed oil or a vegetable oil and rub it all over the wooden handles after use. So if you're going to rinse them off or just wipe them down and dry them with a dry cloth, then rub a little bit of linseed oil or vegetable oil into the wood to prevent them from splitting, and it prevents splinters when you're using them, which is a good thing as well. Okay, when it comes to pots and other equipment that you're using, maybe your gloves, your pots, trays, punnets, stakes, any other little bits and pieces that you're using in the garden, to prevent the spread of diseases, wash them really well and just put them out in the sun to dry. The sun is a form of antibacterial process, so give them a wash. Nice soapy water. I like to use just a natural cleaner. I have a eucalyptus cleaner. It's like an all-purpose cleaning product made of natural ingredients and essential oils. I find that really good. Just a few drops of that into the warm water in a big bucket and just wash off the pots and equipment, and that antibacterial liquid would help to kill off any of the disease pathogens that might be in pots, because you especially don't want to spread them if you're going to be potting up or doing some propagating or other growing. You don't want any pathogens or other things in those pots that could kill off your plants. You can wipe things down with a natural antibacterial solution. So that's actually Melaleuca. This is a lovely image from a Melaleuca oil company. And there are a few products around. There is actually one particular product that has the eucalyptus oil in a spray can, if you do like spray cans, or you can get them and put them into like a hand sprayer with a little bit of water if you prefer not to use aerosol cans. But there are products available that you can actually spray on your garden tools, or just put a natural oil that is naturally has antibacterial properties on a cloth and wipe down your tools, especially after you've been cutting plants with diseases. So that's a really good way of keeping your tools disease free, so you're not spreading any germs around the garden. So if you keep everything nice and clean and dry and sharp, then your tools are going to be ready when you are heading out into the garden. So I think it's wonderful when you feel like it's time to go out to the garden and do some pruning or some digging or whatever it is you're doing. And it's lovely to go out to the garden shed and just find all your tools ready to go. I think there's nothing worse than getting excited about doing some gardening and finding that your tools are rusty or dirty, or they need something done to them first. So if you look after them after you use them, or even maybe on a rainy day or a day that's not suitable for gardening, you might want to spend some time in your garden shed or wherever you keep all your tools and equipment and just have a little regular tidy up. Now, in the community, in our monthly growing guides, I do include a week's gardening activities of just caring for your tools and equipment. It might be a time when we're resting our garden beds, or we've put in green manure crops and they're growing, or we've sown our seeds and other jobs are done. And it is a nice time just to spend, a couple of hours or an hour just getting your tools and equipment into really good care, so they are ready when you want to head outside and enjoy some gardening time. Now, if you've got anything, any other questions or anything that you would like to know, make sure that you please post them in our Soil to Supper community Facebook group, or you can go into our forum and start a nice thread of a conversation in our forum. The other thing is, if you wanted to know more on different tools and equipment to use in your garden, head into our courses and find the Savvy Gardener course, and you'll find lesson 3, which is on the tools and equipment to use in your garden. So if you haven't yet completed the 5 steps to become a savvy gardener course, you'll find that inside the community on the same page with the masterclasses. So make sure you complete that course, especially if you're just starting out in your garden. It's a really good introductory course to get going, and then follow all the other information and you will be definitely a savvy gardener. So make sure you head to those extra links. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me for our little masterclass this week on caring for our tools and equipment. And it is an important part of gardening, because without the equipment, we really couldn't get a lot done, and we want to make sure that we're getting our jobs done properly. So please post any questions in our Facebook group, and I look forward to seeing you next month for another masterclass together. Thanks for joining me, and enjoy an amazing day. Bye for now.